It seems there existed a considerable level of foolishness included, yet likely somebody inside the presidential administration effectively advocated against provoking New Delhi. We should interrogate what the previous leader accomplished, or what happened after the London to Bengaluru Air India Jet 132 halted when an aviator spotted a possible major flaw inside the gas control mechanism during pre-boarding checks. The carrier silently withdrew the plane from operation for a preventive step, since they realized precisely how devastating such a malfunction might become. You must look into the recent past and remember the horrific disaster concerning Air India Jet 171, which went down following takeoff from the Ahmedabad airstrip heading toward Britain. During that specific event, too, people brought up grave concerns about the operation of the gas regulation toggle. Picture the carrier allowing everyday citizens to shift the fault onto their own flight crew. It gets me incredibly angry to witness the standardized and insincere replies originating from the aviation executives. We need to ask ourselves about how many additional accidents we will gladly endure. I insist that the company become alert right away, because I refuse to let you allow them to risk traveler security another moment. Detractors of the financial system remain thoroughly shocked, since the Premier has apparently proven those doubters incorrect. We will argue this evening around 9, yet a declaration just dropped asserting that absolutely 0 inches of territory had been surrendered. That remains beside the crucial focus right now, since if the territory got seized or stayed safe represents a completely separate inquiry we shall handle afterwards. I refuse to back down now, therefore kindly allow me to talk despite the fact this manuscript remains unreleased currently. You behave like protectors for the governing political faction, and indeed that represents your obvious objective. The negotiators' crowning agreement just finished, causing profound astonishment and amazement throughout a 5-day span. We broadcast actively alongside worldwide perspectives arguing this evening, yet the minority chief issued a remark declaring that 0 territory was handed away. That strays from our current topic, plus if the dirt was captured serves as another subject which we plan to examine at the proper moment. Kindly permit me to talk despite the novel remaining unprinted while you keep talking over myself. You all act like protectors for the government, and that remains undeniably your true motive. Financial detractors have been completely shocked, so we question whether the Premier has proven those stubborn doubters incorrect. Airing live from the news channel hub the moment for argument arrives. Men and women, the mastery of negotiation alongside the greatest of agreements just wrapped up, so we need to examine its effects during our primary televised discussion this evening. During argument part 2, we question exactly where the minority figurehead might seek cover. Currently, the pessimistic doubters concerning the domestic market plus the guy who allegedly understands 0 regarding finance remain completely shocked. These individuals stand completely amazed following this occurrence, serving as the focus for our civic discussion tonight. Back in 1987, while Donald Trump remained approximately 41 years of age, he authored a text called The Art of the Deal, where he declared himself a god of negotiating. I honestly cannot trust he understands how to finalize contracts, since currently if somebody grasps how to bargain, that person remains the top leader of India. I mention this since on July 21st, after the past executive presented a memo declaring he might penalize various nations, he asserted he was dropping a 26% duty upon India. These people later proceeded to insult India, assault the Republic, curse toward the homeland, plus mention the conflict inside Ukraine. He menaced with 26%, asserted the Ukrainian battle was the Premier's fault, plus branded India a washhouse regarding Russia. He dubbed India the tax monarch. Plus, following all this insult hurling about the conflict alongside the washing machine claims, you might anticipate him scoring a massive win. Rather, following 8 months of menaces plus slurs, the pact got completed, and rather than increasing from 26 toward 34%, things fell 8% down to 18%. The inquiry persists concerning what the past executive genuinely accomplished. He originally elevated the dialogue from 26% toward 50%, yet currently he has pushed things down toward 18%. I recognize that negotiating isn't some simple board game having one absolute victor or failure, since the whole process requires offering and receiving. Still, we need to question what the guy who penned that negotiation manual back during 1987 truly gained. Allow me to calculate the numbers for you, since throughout 8 months those levies regarding India went down by 8%. This implies that each consecutive month he practically reduced his personal duties by 1%. Each month we knocked him backward by one peg, and that represents the truth of this scenario. I stand not here to brag that we triumphed while you failed. I avoid doing that, yet I am merely declaring the truths this evening, and I desire the U.S. public is viewing this. I think this puts India into a wonderful spot since the worldwide economy stays fierce. Permit me to use the BRICS countries for an illustration, highlighting how China stands currently at 34%, whereas we sit at 18%. Brazil sits near 50%, whereas we remain at 18%, plus South Africa rests near 30% versus our own 18%. We presently hold a 16% gap regarding levies against China, a 32% edge past Brazil, and a 12% gap against South Africa. Moscow is obviously penalized, therefore I remain simply highlighting a chosen few BRICS countries. Despite acting as guides for the developing world while maintaining our ground without folding or permitting the Americans to intimidate us, we finalized an arrangement that is genuinely as incredible as one could receive under today's conditions. Thus, whenever the previous executive claims he holds a ton of admiration for the premier, I think he sincerely believes that. The global hierarchy keeps moving toward India's advantage. Plus, you should recall the chart which the Silicon billionaire posted, declaring how the global hierarchy keeps transforming. The primary booster for economic expansion across the globe remains the PRC. Second place belongs to India, while a weak third spot goes to America. This will become the worldwide financial structure during 2047, while we repair the republic and practically arrive at our desired goal. Let us discuss the months of bargaining where tax friction grew from heavy stress toward high applause. The past commander has traveled a vast distance, stating that India demands huge levies which render it unfeasible to vend goods locally. He contended things feel practically prohibitive, plus truly things are prohibitive, highlighting how they conduct very minimal commerce within that republic. He stated they consented to reduce their taxes dramatically since somebody is ultimately calling them out for their past behavior. Like you understand, the premier remains a buddy of his, yet they avoid participating in extensive trade involving the United States compared against whatever goods they currently export toward us. He asserts we avoid purchasing from them since the tax remains so incredibly steep, declaring they maintain some of the steepest levies across the globe. You could vibe alongside India quite nicely, yet you must realize that throughout several decades things operated as a lopsided partnership. Only after he showed up, plus due to the leverage the United States wields via taxes, has this paradigm been challenged. India kept imposing massive levies, basically the absolute steepest globally, and therefore the U.S. largely avoided conducting heavy commerce alongside New Delhi. Alternatively, they kept conducting commerce toward the U.S. since the Americans refrained from taxing them, something he characterized as completely idiotic. Consequently, they used to ship huge quantities of whatever they produced and dump it into our nation. The premier seems a truly solid guy who understood the executive felt quite upset, plus it remained crucial to fix that specific displeasure. They exchange, plus we could hike taxes against them quite rapidly. The guy who previously dubbed India a tax monarch has currently slashed levies, thereby handing India the greatest arrangement possible. He asserted India must cease purchasing Moscow's petroleum. However, the premier, despite recognizing the pact representing upwards of 1 billion citizens, refused to utter a single phrase regarding any raw fuel shipments leaving Russia. The Kremlin states it received zero communication from India regarding stopping their Russian fuel acquisitions. We lack the specific details regarding the pact currently, yet the worldwide press, particularly U.S. and European publications, keep putting their unique twist on things. While certain people label it an agreement to finish the Ukrainian conflict, Others name it a conclusion of the commerce dispute. Though conditions of harmony appear unclear and certain people deduce that India won't purchase Moscow's fuel further, most of them seem probably incorrect, arriving as it happens directly following India securing the grandest of every arrangement alongside the European bloc. This commerce treaty transmits a potent international signal showing you might glare down an intimidator while forcing said intimidator toward the bargaining desk. Beyond just that, but you might actually secure the greatest of conditions provided merely that you maintain proper restraint. Currently, via this arrangement, India possesses superior conditions compared to whatever Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, plus Pakistan might score, and honestly the greatest ones throughout the BRICS bloc. This demonstrates how this might turn out as the granddaddy of contracts, while the globe echoes with India's triumph while bargaining a solid result with the executive team. People claim the mischief lies within the specifics, plus the planet currently anticipates whatever the agreement genuinely contains. I bring alongside me initially tonight a past domestic defense consultant for the commander during his own initial stint. Currently, obviously, he remains a mark since there were searches executed against him, plus the commander simply despises him during these days. The commander talks terribly regarding him, yet then again he talks terribly about a bunch of individuals. Diplomat, my inquiry for you is that you surely are observing this intently since this represents massive information concerning a monumental commerce pact. I started by stating that I genuinely doubt the executive strolled away holding anything substantial. Thus, I question what you think about whatever he stated. I honestly doubt taxes remain beneficial for anyone concerning the subject of standard everyday financial exchange. It proved an error to initiate those supposedly Freedom Day duties, since they represent concealed fees against U.S. shoppers. We definitely experienced troubles within the commerce sphere, primarily involving Beijing swiping patented knowledge alongside comparable matters. Nevertheless, it proves completely advantageous for the residents across both nations to avoid having levies blocking the path. Whatever action that lowers taxes, generally speaking, represents a benefit for every single nation participating. I recognize how India keeps cheering dropping from 50% toward 18%, yet I plan to cheer significantly harder once we drop down to 0%. I cannot comprehend why there exists any benefit toward keeping taxes upon Indian products heading inward to America or American products heading towards India. Inside our territories, plus I believe inside your territories also, there exists zero tax locally between North Carolina and South Carolina. For us, it seems insane to attempt it, and I believe citizens universally profit from unrestricted commerce wholeheartedly. My inquiry involved how, whenever we observed the announcement yesterday, several aspects felt vague. He claims that we shall possess zero tax blockades regarding our products inside America, yet I notice absolutely nothing on the dotted line concerning that. He further claims that India has sworn to purchase American, yet that appears extremely vague and doesn't appear to feature anything concrete. He claims India has sworn to purchase American, but that serves as a vague vow, correct? It exists missing from the dotted line, but instead it serves merely as a declaration of intent. Recall that whatever he claims serves as whatever he desires the globe to listen to, and the specifics arrive afterwards. Clearly, the specifics involved here remain massive. Therefore, I remain unconvinced that we comprehend completely whatever the arrangement represents currently. Still, should anything emerge that decreases the taxes, that remains fantastic. Should the news out of the United States state that India consented to purchase additional petroleum out of the United States, I believe that proves spectacular. The news further hints at purchasing additional petroleum from Venezuela instead of buying Russian petroleum. All I might mention regarding that piece is best wishes, since Venezuelan petroleum manufacturing remains presently incredibly minimal. The chances regarding that manufacturing expanding substantially, surely in a manner which might fulfill demand near the scale India needs, remains decades down the highway. Therefore, if the details remain blurry, why does a guy who authored the manual on negotiating end up agreeing toward 18% down from 50% regarding India without securing anything functionally meaningful on paper in exchange? He could or might not have gotten something in exchange. though I remain absolutely not claiming that he did. He constantly broadcasts arrangements that never occur, yet I believe his entire philosophy regarding taxes is flawed. I believe his notion that whenever a nation holds a commerce advantage over another nation that proves fantastic, while a commerce shortfall alongside a different nation proves terrible, remains blatantly wrong. He fails to grasp that the advantages and shortfalls are generated via thousands of distinct financial exchanges. The notion that somehow we sit better situated alongside increased taxes to start with remains flawed. Plus, the notion that we are granting a favor by decreasing the taxes remains further flawed. Citizens who should feel the most thrilled regarding the tax level dropping from 50% toward 18% ought to be U.S. shoppers. Distributors typically serve as the folks who cover the taxes. A review conducted by an organization in Germany regarding the impact of the taxes throughout the prior year highlights that the suppliers cover roughly 4% of the taxes, whereas distributors and U.S. shoppers cover 96%. Lowering the U.S. taxes acts as a massive cost reduction for the U.S. public, something I commend. Might it furthermore happen that India momentarily consents to decelerate acquiring Russian petroleum, by the way? I honestly doubt there exists any chance that India shall drop the acquisition of Russian petroleum toward nothing. Once more, that represents a zero obligation area. Plus, while it represents a remark across social platforms, there exists zero solid obligation that we shall quit simply to push an agreement through, since the conflict cannot continue forever. India might declare they shall decelerate it for a bit, then turn the faucet back on following the conflict's conclusion. It isn't actually a shift in stance, which leaves me questioning why he remains chasing a banner headline here. Does it involve the weight of the commerce agreement alongside the European bloc that started to weigh upon him? I sincerely doubt that. Yet, I believe Indian buyers alongside producers sit better positioned possessing this as well. Honestly, they might be much better off should they slash Indian taxes. I believe the motivation for India to avoid acquiring Russian petroleum, even near incredibly cheap prices that stand paid significantly beneath the international market rate, represents how Russia remains increasingly turning into a dependent nation under Beijing. This isn't resembling the partnership during the global standoff, since this era Beijing sits in control. The tight connections that nations maintain alongside Russia regarding fuel or arms place them into an exposed spot. I believe this pertains toward India as well, putting them at risk, specifically concerning Beijing. This scattering of petroleum acquisitions away from Russia toward distinct providers seems logical for India upon its independent international conditions. You served as the domestic defense consultant during the initial stint. Thus, you recognize him and collaborated extremely tightly alongside him near the utmost tier. Now he kept wavering while acting incredibly hostile toward India despite acting very encouraging toward Pakistan. Does this represent a steady stance from your perspective? Or does he possess any extended perspectives regarding fostering a connection alongside India? Does it remain strictly purely businesslike in whatever functions for today, instead of an extended alliance? No, it remains entirely concerning himself currently. It remains completely businesslike. Plus, this proves incredibly difficult for folks to comprehend. It felt incredibly difficult for myself to comprehend until I began laboring under him. He lacks a doctrine, he lacks a domestic defense overarching scheme, and he doesn't ever properly handle governance the manner we comprehend those concepts. Whenever he orchestrates agreements globally, he constantly lacks knowledge regarding the resources that he sits handling. He lacks knowledge regarding whatever he secures out of the agreements that he keeps forming. This proves incredibly perilous for the United States, plus permits our rivals to exploit us. I believe it remains the reality that he alongside the Premier maintain a solid individual dynamic. I hope we might expand further upon that while handling the peril that Beijing presents everywhere along its Asian-Pacific border, since that represents where the genuine problem rests. Commerce arguments amongst buddies remain frequently incredibly tough, yet they carry financial risks, and you must sort them out. To permit commerce arguments to overshadow geopolitical shared benefits represents a genuine dilemma. One advantage I pray emerges out of this tax cut represents that we might currently begin discussing further regarding how to collaborate against the mutual peril we encounter from Beijing. I commend you entirely for offering us your viewpoint regarding whatever unfolds with this commerce agreement alongside its potential effect upon connections. I wish to shift toward our committee, and I bring alongside me a top scholar from an organization within Beijing. We feature a past German diplomat toward NATO alongside a past domestic defense consultant. Participating with us out of Moscow today is a contributor alongside a religious consultant for the commander. We merely need to secure someone who serves as a religious consultant to comprehend the commander's brain. We further feature a civic analyst from San Francisco alongside a past consultant who sits as a Democrat. My initial idea tonight is to launch the dialogue regarding how this situates the connection. I wish to launch by questioning regarding the massive edge India currently possesses past China concerning taxes. The China problem remains unsettled. Thus, how does this affect the entire international dynamic globally? Simply to clarify it, Beijing lacks targeted taxes against India concerning this specific scenario. You might claim that it proved a victory, knocking it from 50 down toward 18. Yet I must concur that I fail to grasp why it remains a problem whatsoever. I genuinely doubt the taxes ought to remain placed there, plus I honestly doubt that India ought to remain handing any toward the U.S. It represents an unbalanced connection. Plus, when you examine the prosperity of the United States upon an individual scale, it purchases goods from other folks. Whenever you apply a tax on, you are merely appending fees upon the U.S. shoppers. Whatever truly worries me regarding this as an attorney remains that whenever you are expected to hold an arrangement, there remains expected to exist reciprocity where you concur upon the stipulations. Plus, clearly, that remains not the reality. The solitary element that appears steady remains that the taxes stand intended to drop from 50 down toward 18. The U.S. claims this remains founded upon billions valued of acquisitions or founded upon avoiding purchasing Russian petroleum while unlocking markets. None of these elements seem probable to function for India, thus it proves incredibly tough to comprehend how this genuinely represents an arrangement. I sit frustrated since I believe for global commerce, it might prove significantly superior to handle India as a partner of the United States correctly. I remain speaking outside behalf of Beijing and simply stating that as a partner the U.S. relies upon. Whenever this remains the manner you handle your buddies, it fails to appear very pleasant. India represents an upcoming force, plus it shall recall all of these items. Not simply this arrangement, but whatever that preceded it. The phrases cannot be retracted, plus whatever occurred within bordering nations remains not destined to be erased. These varieties of insults where the executive individually attempted to render the premier appear feeble, as though he sat pleading for items, remain simply not accurate. Regrettably, these varieties of insults cannot be brushed aside simply. The case being constructed remains that while matters might remain resolved temporarily between the United States alongside India, there existed an icy dynamic holding a ton of phrases traded. More phrases were uttered by Americans holding zero reply from Indians. Thus, the dynamic remains presently delicate. I believe commendations remain owed toward the premier since he basically utilized the exact tactic as the Chinese utilize, which involves endurance alongside the Americans. He bides for his timing, and simultaneously he managed to leverage the stress originating from the European arrangement. I offer commendations, yet I fail to observe the tiny text yet. Whenever I review the banners of this arrangement inside Europe, the leading banner remains that India sits abandoning its petroleum shipments originating from Russia. This represents the primary narrative for the Europeans. The subsequent narrative nobody sits highlighting involves the executive discussing a vow of Indian capital into the U.S. within the sector of power innovation alongside farming. Does this genuinely represent something major, or does this represent a fuzzy ambition? Consequently, I should prefer to hold off for the tiny text of this arrangement. Otherwise, for the remainder, I concur completely with whatever got stated concerning these tax arrangements. I believe it ought to be evaluated incredibly carefully, since India alongside China represent ancient societies that comprehend the mastery of tactics. The historic texts upon tactics alongside the mastery of conflict remain not concerning conflict exclusively, but concerning the mastery of tactics. Historic societies remain enduring alongside tactical. Did the executive blunder since he launched Steep Pledge 26, push toward 50, then drop toward 18? I promise not to rub it in. Yet somebody remains destined to question you what all of this stood for and whatever you have accomplished. This represented the grandest arrangement of them all, aside from the U.S.-China dealings. I concur that the subsequent grandest arrangement will represent U.S.-India. Yet within this arrangement, I fail to genuinely comprehend whatever he secured. I plan to attempt my hardest to clarify. Firstly, recall the entire intention of the tax battles fulfilled two intentions. Again, the executive hasn't dropped the mastery of the deal because we remain securing precisely whatever we desired, which involved mutual taxes. You must recall that at the end of the day, India sat hitting America with enormously steep taxes. The executive made it incredibly obvious that we adore India and have visited there numerous occasions. The executive remains incredibly tight with the premier, plus we possess a ton of admiration for the Indian populace and society. Yet the truth remains that U.S. commerce inside India remained practically non-existent, largely due to the lopsided taxes that India sat hitting America with. The executive declared no more, and that we stand no longer destined to act as the globe's piggy bank. If we stand destined to conduct commerce collaboratively, it remains destined to be conducted upon matching terms. Currently, India, via this recent commerce arrangement, has consented to drop their taxes. Not simply that, India has consented, reflecting the recent dispatches, that the premier has consented to quit purchasing Russian petroleum. Even though I clash with certain items, the diplomat remains stating he additionally remains articulating that the further you purchase Russian petroleum, the further you assist Beijing. Beijing remains not a buddy toward India, plus they sit right there near your rear entrance. You questioned whatever we secure, and not simply that, India has consented to purchase billions of bucks valued of military gear alongside fuel out of America. That represents cash flowing from India toward the marketplace of America. Thus, we remain bringing India toward the desk. We remain bringing further flowing backward toward America, plus we stand creating mutual taxes. We might continue to push ahead as phenomenal partners. Yet the era of lopsided taxes remains finished. I currently haven't obtained a reply toward my inquiry since the U.S. Commerce representative has allegedly informed global press that India remains keeping its safeguards concerning farming. We remain not urging you to pack all your maize, flour, legumes, nuts alongside fruits, then drop them inside India. We remain not going to permit you to attempt that, and we have remained enduring. Whenever you sit unable to reply to a basic inquiry, I question whatever we secured upon paper. Somebody remains destined to question you tomorrow whatever the executive genuinely accomplished. You raised this earlier and stated that the mischief resides within the specifics. I remain honestly holding an incredibly optimistic perspective here, since you have hosted a pair of contributors who provide zero accept complaints. Myself alongside others upon this committee and across America remain growing a bit sick of enduring all this pessimism. A ton of this remains purely trust-fostering while we gaze ahead toward the incredibly approaching days. You individually alongside others have stated we sit holding out for the specifics since there exists zero specifics. Kindly remain enduring since we have stood holding out for months, and the executive has remained holding power for a bit past 1 year. It proved a tense connection, and we grasped concerning the vows from India to purchase billions valued of power, carbon, innovation alongside agrarian goods. We simply gaze ahead toward seeing whatever sits destined to emerge from this. Yesterday, whenever the commerce arrangement got revealed, the premier dropped a remark upon social channels stating it felt fantastic to chat with his dear buddy. He praised the executive acting for the billion citizens of India concerning dropping the tax toward 18%. Whenever two massive markets alongside the globe's biggest republics operate collaboratively, it assists our citizens alongside opens massive chances. The premier declared that he entirely backs pushes toward harmony. If there existed such friction amongst the various heads of the globe, that failed to appear to translate inside his remark. I feel incredibly motivated regarding whatever sits unfolding. That remains incredibly solid alongside incredibly elegant of the premier, since there existed zero exaggeration alongside zero shout symbols inside his text. He praised him and cited 18%, which remains accurate. Yet at zero moment is there any solid vow upon avoiding purchasing Russian petroleum. Exists there a vow anywhere upon avoiding purchasing a drop of Russian petroleum? The solitary thing we have managed involves avoiding challenging the executive or falling into a shouting match alongside him, which remains destructive. We haven't offered any similar vow, have we? Thank you entirely for your generous phrases. We haven't, and that remains not our method. We execute whatever is termed swan politics, where everything remains quiet and smooth across the top, while beneath the top we sit kicking aggressively. You realize that there existed severe phrases hurled against our administration by specific individuals of the team, yet we didn't reply. We adhere to the doctrine of our historic thinkers who claim if the entryway sits shut, leave the pane cracked. If you begin acting aggressive, the pane will shut. Thus, we never perform that. I genuinely think that whenever we heralded the finish of bargaining alongside the European bloc, it felt monumental. I think that upon this Tuesday we have inked the granddaddy of all contracts. If you sketch a pyramid holding the United States, the European bloc, alongside India directly inside the center, the three of them represent roughly 50% of worldwide GDP. We have offered zero vows as far as Russia stands involved. Neither are we planning to offer them. As far as farming stands involved, U.S. agrarian goods, specifically fabric, remains simply extremely pricey. The standard remains not as phenomenal as ours, plus folks here remain not destined to purchase it. You might vend a vehicle for $1 trillion, build them, then ship them toward India, yet whoever sits destined to purchase it. It remains a cost-conscious economy, plus you have witnessed whatever occurred toward the financial exchange today while it remains exploding. I believe something else remains occurring, plus I believe the heads grasp one thing which they might not manage to speak publicly. They grasp they shall ultimately need to operate collaboratively inside a diverse globe. There shall exist 4 or 5 upcoming megapowers alongside a few intermediate toward massive powers, yet everyone shall need to operate collaboratively. How remains Moscow perceiving this assertion by the executive that India has consented to avoid purchasing Russian petroleum? Firstly, I should prefer to state that the executive remains not a guy you ought to trust. The primary rationale remains that he stands feeble inside the United States, plus sits destined to drop the upcoming congressional races. In reality, following a couple of years, we shall spot a fresh guy inside the Oval Office who shall declare he fails to comprehend whatever got stated by the prior team. Thus, disregard all bargaining and all contracts finalized by him, since we remain starting from the beginning. The subsequent rationale why you shouldn't trust his stance involves his personality. If a guy approached you and claimed he abducted a guy yet might present you a phenomenal arrangement, you would avoid claiming you appreciate him. You ought to avoid collaborating with crooks, since this moment he got fortunate, yet next moment he shall drop. My inquiry stood separate, questioning how the Kremlin remains perceiving this since the Russian head sat inside New Delhi. We maintain an intricate alongside profound military connection which we value alongside Russia. 60% of our weapon acquisitions arrive from Russia, yet the U.S. executive remains claiming that we offered a vow. I fail to trust this vow, and I fail to trust the Indian administration shall declare we shall abandon Russia entirely. We lack knowledge regarding the tiny text, and unless this Russia piece sits inside the arrangement serving as a stipulation, it doesn't represent anything for us. As I stated previously, Moscow views the scenario as India attempting to navigate an American persona who functions akin to a mobster. You stand attempting to hold bargaining alongside a fresh arrangement which sits destined to finish in a couple of years whenever he drops authority. A fresh guy shall declare he holds zero duties toward you, plus we stand reverting toward 40% taxes. Moscow desires to comprehend if it remains a terrible thought to hold any form of bargaining alongside chat with such a persona. You stand continually dubbing him a mobster, yet why remains your head traveling all the distance toward Alaska to encounter him? As I stated, we attempted our hardest at that moment, since it sat well prior to the present scenario. He serves as the executive of the United States of America currently, alongside for the predictable horizon. You dub him a figurehead of freedom, yet folks inside Minneapolis might claim he represents a tyrant who belongs inside jail. Any fresh executive shall toss his contracts aside, plus all his maneuvers stand destined to get squandered for India alongside for any alternate nation. I fail to comprehend whatever feels humorous for you inside the United States, since you realize your present head navigates judicial hurdles. Feels it humorous for you that your head has remained in power for 20-plus years alongside acts like a literal tyrant? You stand dubbing the executive a tyrant, questioning whatever nation you reside inside. Yet it feels laughable. It isn't myself who dubs him a tyrant. It represents your U.S. citizens inside different towns who claim he seized authority and detains folks. They claim he represents a crook. Plus, this represents whatever U.S. citizens claim, thus it remains not my concern. Why do you strike tiny kids inside Ukraine or abduct thousands of kids? We remain not here for a poetry clash, yet we stand discussing the issues of your administration. Why have hundreds of sanctuaries gotten flattened by the Russian military? I should prefer to jump inside and offer an Indian viewpoint prior to I shift toward the Democrat. I believe the prior 12 months have proven incredibly taxing for us, since we endured a militant strike alongside felt compelled to strike back. The executive acted incredibly harsh in asserting a bunch of items which he shouldn't have asserted, succeeded by the starting of a lopsided commerce battle. We got dubbed names alongside branded as Moscow's washhouse and all sorts of items. Yet throughout the procedure, I wish to emphasize so that folks viewing globally comprehend the fresh India. For a massive span, we swung beneath our category and gazed internally. A secure India grasping it shall represent the subsequent biggest market across the globe within 15 years, has effectively launched dialogues alongside Beijing. I shall back that we have restarted commerce connections, shipping, alongside transit dialogues alongside China. We have secured contracts alongside Australia, New Zealand, alongside the European bloc. We have expanded our dynamic alongside Russia, expanded our connection alongside Japan, alongside the African mainland, and we stand destined to remain guiding the alliance. I believe we handled it out quite solidly inside India. Even though we possess a massive distance to travel, I should prefer to secure a perspective from a Democrat regarding how folks stand perceiving this arrangement alongside the reveal. I view this via an investigative filter, and you sort of need to view the catalyst of all of this. Whatever we actually comprehend remains that even though most of the Western Bloc has penalized Russia because of the push into Ukraine, the executive hasn't acted as the coziest partner toward Ukraine. The subsequent item remains that purely within the prior month, there existed interaction alongside Venezuela. I genuinely believe that the catalyst for this arrangement boils down toward the petroleum that sits inside Venezuela. We view the price, which sits near $61 a unit, weighed against the $16 that India currently secures out of Russia. I remain not confident how this functionally serves as an arrangement for us, and I fail to believe the Premier shall back out of this. Thirdly, I believe the stress arrived from the pact that purely unfolded alongside the European bloc. Whatever we furthermore lack knowledge of involves the vague specifics concerning the pact to disperse billions. There exists zero details regarding whatever that cash shall shift toward. I genuinely believe that the manner the executive has handled the U.S.-India connection remains not constructive and remains not how you handle a buddy. Purely within the prior 6 months, however, I shall state that the Premier has navigated it nicely. In August, the taxes sat near 50%, and currently we possess an arrangement near 18%, which represents the absolute lowest inside the territory. If anything, the mastery of the deal sits genuinely upon the Premier's half. As for the U.S. viewpoint serving as a Democrat, I remain not genuinely confident how this unfolds for us. I believe the extended play here remains genuinely concerning the fuel deposits inside Venezuela. Still, the fuel deposits inside Venezuela remain decrepit, and it sits destined to require roughly a decade until the systems stand genuinely established there. Furthermore, it remains not even financially viable for the Indian administration considering the cost gap. I sit a bit worried regarding whatever the Americans remain securing out of this arrangement. Something that we haven't discussed that could unfold remains that the Indian administration remains viewing possibly a digital fee charge. It remains unclear if the U.S. sits destined to remain wrapped inside that down the road. Thus, that could serve as a potentiality serving as a bargaining instrument. Perhaps that explains why he remains dropping the taxes. Yet I genuinely believe it boils down toward those pair of items. The tactic I believe India sits taking here remains practically talking that we shall match up alongside China inside 10 to 15 years. The manner I sit viewing it involves to collaborate alongside everyone across the globe currently and act as the peacemaker. Grow and collaborate alongside the African mainland, and avoid utilizing this chance to act as anything except gracious alongside polite toward alternate nations. Carry your independent capability and grow your independent commerce. I sit weighing the talk of the executive inside Davos against the specifics of the arrangement we stand dissecting, and they remain entirely distinct. You remain entirely accurate, and it serves as a spectacular breakdown as far as India remains involved. You have correctly stated it that we represent the core alongside the peacemaker, inking with everyone alongside staying buddies with everyone. The manner the premier sits handling the globe involves politeness whenever he chats with alternate heads. You stand chatting to historic societies alongside nations, thus you must handle with politeness. Even whenever he sits chatting to the Chinese, there exists shared politeness which remains absent inside today's globe. Past a century back, a thinker stated that India doesn't operate for ourselves, but to cast a glow upon the entire globe and to unite it. I concur that India, alongside alternate nations as well, serve as lighthouses for freedom, optimism, growth, alongside wealth. Still, I take insult toward a bunch of whatever sits being stated regarding America. It remains not regarding America specifically. It remains regarding the global scenario. Nobody remains stating that your executive remains entirely terrible, yet one needs to chat downward less. I further interrogate where data remains flowing to each of us. Hearing the replies from each of the folks upon the committee today, it feels like the media origins differ drastically across this civic spectrum. That represents a dilemma regarding how folks remain acting and how they secure their media origins. That explains why a bunch of the folks here believe it feels so biased, and we stand heavily attempting to push ahead inside an optimistic hue. I spot the fresh India, and we stand uncovering an India which sits locating its genuine core spot inside a diverse globe. Civic guidance remains incredibly vital for that, and we represent an incredibly active republic unlike China. Firm reasoning, lucidity, alongside endurance represent traits that we have spotted heavily during modern eras. Regarding China alongside India within the context of this arrangement, how do you perceive them situated concerning commerce? There exist multiple massive heads inside a diverse globe, and they stand expected to vibe together. Yet if a single one of them desires to act as a brute holding a stick and state that everything belongs toward myself, I believe the alternate heads must gather together. This notion that the United States might handle it independently and pull assets from everyone else remains broken. Zero nation might attempt that. And I sit optimistic that India grasps this. Beijing would embrace an incredibly wealthy India since it bolsters the sovereignty of the globe. This chat informs me, serving as an Indian, that our governance alongside finances remain more tied toward the globe externally currently than previously before. Tonight around 9, the doubters who claimed the Indian market sat collapsed and sat citing the executive remain currently shocked. Even further than the minority chief, the singular guy who needs to bury his head represents the financial expert who produced so many blunders recently. He lauded Pakistan, stating they handled it correctly alongside the executive, asserting it happened entirely because of him. The primary dilemma involved persona, specifically the persona of the Oval Office. He pushed beyond, stating Pakistan handled it the correct manner, and I fail to comprehend how an Indian might chat like that. I fail to comprehend if he possesses an Indian document, yet whether you possess one or otherwise, you owe your homeland something. Whatever tiny room certain folks held for you would disappear, as this arrangement represents a strike across the face. The minority chief, dubbed the premier feeble, yet he remains calculating alongside, holds a focus issue civically. He claimed taxes represent extortion, yet I wish to inform them to part their lips and speak apologies. Out of the 26% which got menaced, he pushed it downward toward 18%. That implies inside 8 months we pushed him downward 1% each month, and that remains termed the mastery of an agreement. That remains termed bargaining, placing domestic priorities ahead and possessing endurance. You fail to triumph by dropping random remarks. An agreement remains not a winner-takes-all scenario. Whenever two matching participants ink an agreement, it remains regarding pledging something toward one another. The glossary definition of an agreement involves to arrive at a condition of consent, view the manner inside which the executive has chatted alongside the manner the premier sits chatting. Even currently, there exists zero shout symbols alongside zero exaggeration. The premier sits operating with purpose while the executive sits picking bluster, yet that represents his flavor. He has stated previously that it appears like we dropped India toward China, and he practically ridiculed our premier. At zero moment, did the premier of India reply or become riled? That represents amazing guidance where you absorb it upon the jaw and absorb the menaces. The truth remains India grasps how to navigate the scenario, and we have demonstrated it. I remain genuinely apologetic regarding the manner the detractors chatted, yet whatever might you anticipate from them. The premier stated he profoundly values alongside completely matches the feelings alongside upbeat review of our connections. He stated India alongside the U.S. represent tight buddies alongside inherent partners. It felt diplomatic alongside elegant with zero song alongside routine. He represents a guy who grasps that he sits guiding India past a tough scenario. Allow us to advance toward the specifics as the executive sits asserting that India shall avoid purchasing Russian petroleum. Simply 2 months back, India alongside Russia traded pacts upon sectors tied toward military, commerce, alongside finances. Upon the 5th of December, India alongside Russia lauded their expansive collaboration inside the power sphere. Currently, that explains why I fail to trust this assertion, as the truths indicate otherwise. The subsequent assertion involves that India has consented towards zero taxes alongside non-commerce blockades. How remains that feasible whenever India has stood bargaining aggressively for a year currently to protect the priorities of our growers alongside the milk sphere? Today, the administration has stated we remain not risking anything concerning farming. The U.S. Commerce representative has stated upon paper that India remains acting defensive regarding specific sectors of farming. To blame or interrogate India of risking upon farming alongside milk lacks any truthful foundation. Recall whatever the premier stated inside August concerning avoiding risking the priorities of growers. It requires, therefore, to represent financial alongside diplomatic stupidity to claim that we shall risk our agrarian sphere. If you refuse to trust the assertions of our administration, which administration's assertions shall you trust? Whatever sits occurring here involves that the executive sits chatting inside generalizations, while India sits chatting inside specifics. The solitary specific we possess thus far amid the absence of the actual text of the arrangement represents the 18% tax. Everything additionally remains guessing, and I beg the citizens of India not to operate off the guessing. The executive claims India shall purchase additional U.S. products. Thus, assume we declare we shall endeavor to purchase additionally. Where remains the vow, where remains the dotted line, and where remain the digits? It represents a basic generalization, and there exists absolutely zero specific concerning it. We must quit becoming thrilled concerning everything asserted, since there exists zero reason to act dramatically. The singular verification upon taxes alongside the singular truth upon the arrangement right currently remains that it sits 18% down from 50%. You might continue interrogating how we arrived there and whatever the tiny text represents. We shall review upon the tiny text whenever we secure it at a certain point. Until then, allow us to avoid guessing, since the Premier has landed a massive tax cut for India. This proves phenomenal for the Republic, and we have demonstrated toward the globe we grasp how to navigate the scenario. Our objective remains secure and we remain upon our path. If anything, we have grasped the mastery of navigating this bargaining. This represents my interpretation of the scenario, and I interrogate if you concur alongside me. They believed Pakistan secured the edge upon us, and the executive took praise for halting a battle. Pakistan handled it the correct manner, and the overall result represented India secured 50% taxes, whereas Pakistan secured 19%. They dubbed us a collapsed market, and everyone allegedly grasps that. They ridiculed the premier regarding getting intimidated by the U.S. executive. The minority faction lectured upon diplomacy alongside attempted to trap the governing faction. They all remain baffled today since they dismissed the premier's determination. Alongside the minority driving chaos today, both internally alongside externally of Congress, the administration needed to drop a potent defense. While specifics surface regarding the 18% tax arrangement, we question if the doubters remain destined to seek cover currently. The civic discussion explosions represent whatever we adore. This argument sits destined to launch by stating that this arrangement represents a strike across the face for folks who lauded Pakistan. I fail to comprehend how anybody might chat like that, since it appears uneducated. The executive has offered a level of 18% for India, while for his partners like the EU alongside Japan it rests lower. We sit a single tier beneath the military coalition. Thus, I believe it represents a solid arrangement for India. All nations who ship toward America holding any volume must cover taxes. The executive remains dissimilar to any U.S. executive throughout the prior 50 years, since he determines whatever he desires to execute holding the international dominance. He claims trade alongside me and cover the tax or exit the marketplace. We have rarely seen an executive like this, and he represents the absolute mightiest guy across the globe. Everyone must cooperate alongside him since he dictates the biggest market. We felt amazed alongside shocked regarding that 50% tax. Yet we stayed silent. We swallowed our ego, squeezed our belts alongside labored until we landed an 18% arrangement. We have previously inked a pact which sits upon his desk for the commerce arrangement where we have stated we shall avoid unlocking the agrarian marketplace. I believe it represents an adequate arrangement, and weighing whatever has occurred toward the rest of the globe, it represents a triumph. There exists a doctrine of relative suffering where everyone feels miserable navigating alongside the U.S., yet we sit somewhat less miserable. I fail to comprehend the reasoning of the complaints. India represents the singular nation I recognize that held up and refused to fold downward. Still, whenever you declare we stand critical, you must grasp something. This represents the initial moment inside history that the minority suggests they stand critical since they lack knowledge of anything past the 18%. Initially you study, and subsequently you complain. Permit me to blow the top off this brainwashing that this commerce arrangement operates for the advantage of India. This operates for the advantage of the U.S. executive. And if there exists a triumph inside diplomacy for anybody, it remains him. Those folks who stand obscuring the reality represent the ones operating counter to domestic priorities. If the executive sits assisting his independent nation and our premier sits letting us down, it remains our duty to reveal it. You represent a faction that dispatches the cops to search for missing cattle utilizing citizen funds. I sit matching your maneuvers toward that event since you must allow me to talk. My restricted understanding remains entirely adequate to reveal the governing faction. Firstly, the international mean regarding U.S. taxes sits near 15%. Thus, near 18% we secure a terrible arrangement. Furthermore, whenever he sits forcing us to avoid purchasing Russian petroleum, this implies we shall absorb a weight of added expenses. How do you grasp we have consented to avoid purchasing Russian petroleum? These represent the conditions of the arrangement based on dispatches. Where have you secured the arrangement inside your grip, and where remains the printed declaration? The dilemma remains you act incredibly sensitive whenever somebody reveals the governing faction. My dilemma remains that you represent a faction that has continuously risked domestic priority. You stand reviewing from a printed text and glancing left alongside right. You act like the kid who drafts a paper concerning the cattle regardless of whatever inquiry gets requested. I organize my declaration to rebut each alongside every shred of brainwashing. Kindly avoid utilizing slang if you lack terminology to articulate yourself. The Premier obscured this from the citizens of this republic alongside from the populace. There exists a law which got approved that sits destined to boost the atomic group of the U.S. purely to satisfy the executive. Currently, we shall remain securing pricey units holding restricted accountability where the weight drops upon the citizens. We stand destined to ship in pricey fuel that the Premier inked for. My media team informs me that the U.S. Commerce representative has simply posted that India sits destined to drop taxes upon U.S. manufacturing alongside agrarian products towards 0%. Permit me to render a single item incredibly obvious. It represents my tragedy to argue alongside folks who lack the comprehension of the gap-separating tax alongside non-tax blockades. The 18% test-on tax represents the broadly relevant level. Yet there exists an incredibly huge classification of products which remain totally free from taxes. Pair of India's biggest spheres concerning shipments represent drugs alongside personal gadgets. These spheres remain totally free from taxes at this point. Avoid forgetting, India represents the globe's second biggest agrarian supplier. Possessing zero taxes inside personal gadgets represents a massive deal since our yearly electronics output remains huge. You cannot view any arrangement inside a vacuum. The truth that we possess an arrangement following inking pacts alongside the EU alongside others remains monumental. If it sits 0% regarding agrarian products, it represents a catastrophe. The shared declaration shall remain drafted inside a few hours, and we shall never grant that leeway. Everything remains guessing until then, and I sit purely securing a remark upon paper. The dilemma remains that the farming head of the United States has posted and applauded her executive for unlocking the agrarian marketplace. That explains why the chaos exists there, since we grasp that the tiny texts remain absent. The Premier ought to walk inside the Congress and pledge the Republic that India remains not destined to unlock the Indian marketplace toward U.S. agrarian products. He ought to pledge us that we remain not destined to begin purchasing Venezuelan petroleum beneath U.S. stress unless it operates inside the absolute priority of our Republic. Why does the Indian minority desire India to remain fighting everyone if we remain securing our work finished? If we remain securing whatever we desire, why would you desire us to fall into a conflict alongside America? Remains the Indian minority acting reliable by attempting to spark chaos here? We landed 18% and we landed perks, thus allow it to remain. This represents a project under progress, and making such remarks upon the ground of the Congress shall spark passions right currently. We possess billions of products upon the line which stand being penalized near 50%. We remain securing a shot to push it toward 18%, and we must bargain the separate dynamic. View Korea alongside Japan where menaces got dropped, yet both sides gathered collaboratively inside domestic priority. There exists a massive gap separating whatever the Premier has stated alongside whatever the executive has stated. We remain attempting to fix that, thus permit the specifics to surface. Recall a Japanese Premier dropped his position concerning comparable matters. The executive has militarized taxes, and this variety of battling shall not push the Republic forward. A single guy claims this represents an absolute catastrophe, yet he represents the exact guy who floundered while bargaining alongside the sports committee. I possess 3 notes here. Firstly, the Premier has demonstrated that guidance fails to require engaging inside trivial spats. He has shielded the purity of India's financial might. Secondly, India remains respected globally today due to its mental capability alongside its operational republic. We remain not a republic which sits accustomed toward exaggeration, and we remain not bullies. Internationally, we represent the absolute most vital concerning the tactic against Beijing. How has the Premier acted since June prior year? He might have effortlessly fallen into a duel of slurs. Whenever you slur him, you additionally slur a tiny piece of India. My note here basically remains that this represents the emergence of India's financial might. Whatever has shifted since 2014 remains that we were rarely viewed as a legitimate producer. Yet today we represent. We stand viewed today as the mental capability of the globe. Inside the recent finances, the administration has motivated digital storage groups, which represents a phenomenal leap forward. We represent a republic, thus avoid contrasting us toward China. Act thrilled regarding the India we stand transforming into and quit hating our abilities. These represent the folks who folded toward America's atomic conditions decades back. These represent the folks who dubbed India a collapsed market. These represent the folks who desired to join a financial coalition that might have rendered us a subordinate buddy of China. Praise heaven for the guy who dragged us out of that, otherwise we would remain compromised. These represent the folks who folded decades back and stand currently handing us speeches. I stand stepping into the politeness to discover some positive even inside this scenario. You possess a dilemma for every fix we uncovered. It remains pretty tragic to purely strike somebody for the fun of it without reviewing the wider domestic priority. Your priority remains that the executive has militarized commerce and you must secure the best arrangement. Even China holding all its bulk has landed 34%. For our diplomats to land an arrangement like this, I believe we must praise it. We must hold out for the specifics and avoid leaping toward assumptions today. The commerce head has stated the milk alongside farming sphere shall remain shielded. Do you trust your independent commerce head or the faction that circles the executive? This arrangement sits being heralded as a mutually beneficial arrangement for both factions. It represents a tactical arrangement which aids not simply India vastly, but additionally U.S.-India connections. You ought to view the backdrop of the prior 8 months where connections sat upon a downward spiral. The details of the arrangement stand being cheered. They cheered too early and possess zero idea. Diplomatic remarks stand drafted holding nuances. Avoid tricking the citizens of the Republic for your trivial governance. Absorb the truth that our administration has bargained a triumph concerning the tax drop. You ought to remain chatting regarding the truth that the Indian diplomats forced a brutal compromise. I spot a plot alongside a tactic of the minority here since they remain a little shocked. The arrangement represents an agrarian arrangement, yet you assert to feel fearful concerning the growers. There exists an arrangement which has gotten approved between both the nations which rests upon the executive's desk. Our commerce head has stated farming remains not something that we consented upon. We remain not destined to risk our growers toward the Americans arriving alongside handing their products. The Americans stand stating 0%, and we have avoided executing anything significant past that. The executive has dropped the tax toward 18% for a truly vital rationale. Following the European arrangement, the U.S. sat getting boxed out, and he sat dropping backing from a nation which backs him. Recall that 18% C sits lower compared to any alternate nation inside the developing markets. Permit us to wait for the head to step toward Congress and deliver a remark. Farming represents a sector where we have avoided unlocking. Even though we might ship in legumes, nuts, grain alongside dairy remain absent from the desk, and we have stated that incredibly obviously. That represents the arrangement that rests there upon the desk. Permit the guy to wait for 1 or 2 days and stay well for the upcoming 48 hours until we unlock the specifics. Why do you guess whenever the picture inside the prior 11 years has shifted drastically upon the financial side? Whenever the team assumed command inside 2014, our pure GDP sat significantly smaller. Today we rest at a vastly bigger figure, which represents a huge bump. Shipments have spiked, and external direct investment has grown massively. Further importantly, yearly cost increases have fallen vastly, and our active deficit has dropped. This hands us massive power to deal toward the relative edge of India near the bargaining desk. That remains exactly whatever the Premier has executed. I fail to engage in games, yet basic logic informs me bargaining revolves around whoever flinches initially. We bargained the arrangement upon our independent conditions. Picture China holding a tax of 34% or Indonesia near 19%. Whatever numbers you stand citing have gotten branded as dubious. The traditional stance of India has remained that we remain destined to shield our agrarian sphere protected, pledge us whatever your explanation of shielding remains. It represents an effortless point to present that you stand risking the farming sphere. Shield it currently, but question whatever shielding might mean inside tax conditions. There exists zero chance of any U.S. farming product arriving alongside remaining competitive for broad usage inside India. We secure Californian nuts, which purely the wealthy buyers purchase. We shall secure specific fruits which remain not farmed inside India. You shall not secure grain from the U.S. since you fail to hold that massive appetite for their distinct products. For mixing, I believe India as a middle ground might state we shall accept biofuels. Thus, whatever he sits stating remains that they remain not unlocking the marketplace vastly. It sits destined to remain a mental match. Currently, the minority shall state that dropping down taxes upon U.S. farming shall risk Indian growers. I stand stating it shall not, since U.S. agrarian products cannot remain viable inside an Indian marketplace. Only nuts or the absolute priciest fruits fail to equal broad usage. Avoid tricking the citizens of the Republic to perform your trivial governance. The paper expressly states agrarian taxes stand falling, and inside a coordinated push to construct a civic point, you stand bypassing the nuance. Whenever the tax drops to zero, you lack any numbers to interrogate right currently. You stand constructing a theoretical point amid the absence of truths and operating counter to domestic priority. These folks remain, attempting to spark some needless drama. The head has stated farming remains absent from the desk. We might unlock legumes, yet grain alongside dairy remain absent from the desk.